Hi everybody, my name is Hannah and this is Pepper and Pine, and today I have a project to share with you. I picked up some of these wood pieces from a local craft store and I thought that I would compare the Lyra watercolor paints and the Winsor-Newton watercolor paints and see how they compare when being used on these wood pieces. Now, we don't use acrylics or other opaque paints on our wood pieces, and I really like seeing the wood grain come through, and I think that the opaque watercolors are a really good choice for that because the more layers you put on, the less translucent it looks, the more opaque it becomes, and you get kind of that look of an acrylic but not with that shiny glossy finish. You can always add a sealant afterwards if you'd like. So we're going to compare those two. So I've got a couple of products here. Our local craft store was moving, so everything was heavily discounted. So I picked up some trees. They only had one package of mushrooms, and they had the little peg people, which we have a lot of peg dolls, but these shapes were slightly different than the ones that we had. So I thought that I would use those. I'm also using the book Making Peg Dolls by Margaret Bloom, and I went through the book and I found a little set that I think will look super adorable with the mushroom that we already are going to be painting. And so I'm going to try to do this little family right here, or rather maybe we'll just do like, little siblings, or maybe I'll just do one. We'll see. But that is the project for today, and I'm just going to get this started. So I'm going to start with the trees and the Winsor-Newton watercolors. I want to do this in kind of a variegated green, so I'm starting with the olive green at the bottom, and I'm noticing that it is quite watery even though it is still pretty pigmented, and it does need 2 coats, but I was kind of hasty in the beginning, but later everything that I paint is going to get a second coat. So for the next part of this tree, I'm going to use the sap green, and I used a little bit too much water. You can see how runny it is, and this is going to be a problem because it's going to stain the areas that are a little bit more pigmented, and then the parts that are more watery are going to be kind of blotchy, and this is going to be the thing that I noticed the most at the end of this project. So I'm just doing a couple of different browns at the base, and I ended up using a Viridian and I think a mixture of another green for the very top of that tree. Alright, so now we're on to the Lyra watercolor paints, and immediately you'll find that these are a lot easier to come on. They're not going to be blotchy, they're going to give a nice even color, and they're going to have somewhat of an opaque look to them, like as if there's a dusting of snow on top of them, and that's what I'm going to notice the most at the end of this project. Okay, so all of them are going to need a second coat of paint. I realize that now, and this is what it looks like after a second coat with the Lyra watercolors, and then this is what it looks like with the Winsor-Newtons. Okay, so I want to show you the results of using the Lyra watercolors as well as the Winsor-Newton ones. And so I wasn't sure how I was going to like each one, and as I did the Winsor-Newton ones, I found that I didn't like it quite as much. It was a little bit blotchy, and the stain from the watercolor just seemed to be uneven. And so I did really like the even tones that the Lyra watercolor paints produced over the Winsor-Newton, but I ended up liking the Winsor-Newton better in the end, maybe in part because it's different than what I've normally done, and also maybe for the color range and being able to see the wood grain. So I ended up doing these two with the Winsor-Newton. So I want to take a minute and just kind of explain what you might expect if you're using these two different kinds of paints to do any kind of painting on wood. The first thing is that I don't typically use an acrylic paint or something that's completely opaque. If you do so, you're not going to see any of the wood grain at all. And I prefer to see some of the wood grain. And you can see that there's some wood grain showing through on the Lyra watercolor paints. This is all done with 2 coats for everything. So you can see that the more coats you will use with the opaque watercolors, the less you're going to see the wood grain. When you're using the Winsor-Newton watercolors, because these are just watercolors, you're going to see the wood grain a lot more. What you're also going to notice is that you're going to end up seeing a lot more blotchiness. Now, this may go away the more coats you do. I only did about 2 coats for each of these. And what happens is that the second that you draw your paintbrush onto the wood, it's going to immediately stain the wood where your paint hit the wood. And as you do more coats, if it's uneven, you're going to see that immediately. And so I had to be really careful. And at first I didn't realize, because that's not the case with your opaque watercolors. So I had to be careful about doing it as even as possible. Even though I was careful, like I think that this was the last one that I did, and so you can see that I feel like it's a lot more even. You can still see areas where it's not as even. The wood itself will absorb the paint differently in different parts. And the amount of coats that you do is also going to affect the finished product. What I like about using just the pure watercolors is that you still see a lot of the wood grain, and I really do like that look. Also, the Winsor-Newton watercolors are new for me. I've been using the Lyra watercolors for about 2 years now, and it was just kind of exciting to try something different and new. And so I did experiment with it quite a bit more than I did with the Lyra watercolor paints. The last thing that I want to say about this is that I did this set for my daughter, and I gave her all 4. And she said, "Oh, you did the 4 seasons." And I looked at them and like, oh, I suppose this could be like the 4 seasons, with the Lyra watercolors being a little bit more opaque. They just felt more like winter, as if like this had a coat of like, you know, snow on it or something. And then you got the summer and the spring and then the fall. And so that was just kind of a nice take on, if you wanted something that was more white or snowy, then the opaque watercolors may give you that look if you wanted to. I don't think you will get that look with the watercolors, but I can't say for certain. And then the last thing is that you can always go more opaque, but you can't necessarily go the other way. So if you did, say, a watercolor and you're like, oh, that's too blotchy, or I don't like the way it looks, you can always try going darker, or rather more opaque, and then you can do the opaque watercolors. And if you still don't like that look, you can then go on to the acrylics or soy-based opaque paint, but you can't really go the other way around. All right, so the last thing I want to do with this is show you what it looks like when you use a beeswax sealant on it. Typically, I don't use a sealant on my peg dolls and my finger puppets because my children are older and we haven't needed that. If you have younger children, or you've got children that are, you know, just gonna be with wet hands or putting things in their mouth, then you might consider sealing it. But I encourage you to check all the products that you're using, from the wood to the sealant to the watercolors. If you anticipate your children putting this in their mouth, you just want to make sure that it's all safe for them to do so. So the beeswax polish that I'm using is called 3 Beautiful Bees. You can find more information about all the products that I'm using today, including the beeswax polish, down in the description box below. This one is lavender lemon, and it smells amazing. So a little goes a long way, and I'm going to show you what it looks like with the Lyra watercolor paints first. And you can see that it immediately makes it darker and shinier. So if you were looking for more of that winter look with, you know, as if it were covered with snow, then doing this may not be a good idea. I happen to really love the richness that is produced when you add the beeswax polish to it. I think it just looks amazing. So let's see what it looks like over the watercolors, the Winsor-Newton watercolors. And it again does that same kind of, it brings out the color, but you can see that the difference in using it versus not using it is fairly mild compared to the dramatic effects that you get when you're using the Lyra watercolor paints and then you use the sealant over it. All right, so I want to show you what they look like now with the sealant, and this is the one with the Lyra watercolors, and this is the one with the Winsor-Newton. And you can see that now they resemble each other a little bit more. You can see more of the wood grain now that the sealant is on. You can see a bit more of the imperfections in how, the brush strokes and how many coats of paint. The Winsor-Newton, the difference between the sealant and the non-sealant is noticeable but not as dramatic. And so that is a personal choice whether you want to seal them or not, and that at least you can see the different effects that each will provide for you. All right, so we're going to move on to the rest of the projects that we have planned. And before we move on, I just want to let you know that I am not going to be adding sealant to the other two trees. My daughter prefers them without the sealant, so she prefers this one over this one. And as far as the Lyra watercolor paints go, I would also avoid using the sealant only just out of preference for the finished product. That's it. All right, so now we're going to move on to the wood mushrooms. And again, we're going to be painting these the same design on both, but we're going to be using two different kinds of paint. The only concern I have is that the white of the watercolor paint may not show up enough, and I may need to use the opaque white watercolor paint from the Lyra watercolor paints, even though I am using the Winsor-Newton. So let's see how it goes. All right, so once again, we're going to start with the Winsor-Newton watercolors, and the white isn't going to work at all. So I need to dip into my opaque white from my Lyra watercolors, but I don't use a tremendous amount on them. And I think in the end, I should go back and add a little bit of brown or just a different color to those stems. I know they're not real stems because these are fungi, but to that part of the mushroom. Next, I'm using this beautiful red for the top of the mushroom, and this red looks especially appropriate for this fly agaric, I believe is the name of this particular mushroom. It's a nice, rich red color. All right, so I'm going to set that aside and work on the other mushroom, and again, I am using the opaque white from the Lyra watercolors, and I didn't use a lot of it, and I think you could probably get a deeper white if you wanted to, but I left it so that it's just barely white and you can still see a lot of wood grain. I also wanted to add these little faint lines underneath the mushroom with a little bit of gray. It turns out okay, but not great, and I also go back and I do that to the other mushroom as well. From a distance, they look fine. Up close, they're pretty much a mess. Now we're going to work on the red, and I am using the red from the Lyra watercolors, which I notice is a little bit different of a red compared to the Winsor-Newtons, and I'll explain more about that a little bit at the end. I got some all over the place. I was so messy and not careful, but this is what they look like when they're done or nearly done, and I do clean up as much of that red as I could off of the one that I use with the Lyra watercolor paints, so do be careful. Don't let it drip all over the place because it will stain, especially the red will stain on the white pretty easily. Now it's time to do those little white dots, and it was so much easier to do it with the Lyra watercolors, both the white on the red Lyra watercolors versus the Winsor-Newtons. Now the Winsor-Newton white isn't going to show up at all. You're going to need an opaque watercolor or an acrylic in order to get those white dots. Now when I started to work with the Winsor-Newton paint, it was so difficult. Again, this is the white Lyra paint on the Winsor-Newton, but it reactivated the Winsor-Newton paints so much that it was really hard to get a nice white. So I would recommend using a different paint medium if you want to work with the white paint. Alright, so I have a lot to say about this set. This is the Lyra watercolors and these are the Winsor-Newtons, and the Winsor-Newtons are just not going to work for two reasons. One, the white is not going to show up at all, and two, I noticed that the white paint mixed more readily with the red base coat more on the Winsor-Newton, making it very difficult to get a nice white crisp dot, versus the Lyra watercolor paints didn't reactivate quite as easily. Now this just may be because I didn't give it enough time to dry, although both of them were dry. It's possible that I would have had a different result if I had sealed them first and then attempted to paint them. Again, I could have used a different watercolor or a different acrylic paint, or, used an acrylic paint over a watercolor paint for the white dots if I wanted them really crisp. I also used a paintbrush. Had I used some other utensil or paintbrush to get the dots on, maybe I would have had less mixing of the red with the white paint. So overall, for this one, the Lyra watercolor paints worked far better. However, I do like the red from the Winsor-Newton. For this particular mushroom, I feel like the Lyra watercolor paint, their red has just a touch of pink, whereas the red from Winsor-Newton seems a little bit more true to red, or it seems a little bit more like a red-orange. But neither of them, when they're, side by side, this one compared to the Lyra watercolor paints looks a little bit more orange, whereas the Lyra one looks a little bit more pink compared to this one, if you want to call this red, if that makes sense. So overall, my final thoughts on each of these paints is that if you were just to buy the one set, I would highly recommend you going with the Lyra watercolor paints if you want a watercolor in order to paint your wood pieces. If you don't really mind what you're using, then an acrylic paint is a great way to go. I personally don't prefer the acrylic paints for my wood pieces. I prefer the watercolors. If you happen to have other kinds of watercolors or even ink markers, then you can experiment and try those as well. I really do like seeing the wood grain underneath. I just find that layering colors may pose new challenges depending on what kind of paint medium you use, and also the biggest challenge of all is actually just using white. Now, I'm not going to seal either of these. I'm going to leave them the way they are. I can't say that I am super pleased with the way that the base of the mushroom and the bottom parts turned out. I wasn't very careful with the Lyra watercolor paints, and a lot of the red got underneath, and same with the Winsor-Newton. And I did try to add white underneath, but that mixed with the red really easily, whereas putting the white here didn't mix with the red as easily. It's just that I had gotten the red on it afterwards. So these, I'm just trying to share my experiences with you so that you can avoid these mistakes if you are trying these out. And if you have both kinds, you can let me know how they are working with you. And if you have a completely different kind of paint medium that you use with your wood pieces, then let me know what you have found, what you like, and how it works with your wood pieces. Okay, so I have one last project to do, but if you want to see any of, for this set, but if you want to see some of the other peg dolls and finger puppet tutorials that I have on my channel, you can tap on the screen right now. I have left a couple of playlists that you might enjoy. And if you want to see the projects that we're doing on a daily basis, don't forget that you can find me on Instagram at Pepper and Pine.